So far, we've looked at why forgiveness is so necessary and important. Scripturally, it goes to the heart of who God is, who Christ is, Christ's mission, and his commission to us. We've looked at what forgiveness is not, and in the last lecture, we considered what forgiveness is and practical reasons why we need to be forgivers. In this lecture, I want to look at the important topic of how to forgive. Now, you may think it's very easy. Just say, I forgive. It's not so easy, particularly in the big hurts. I mean, little minor things, we don't pay it too much mind. Somebody says, I'm sorry, I forgive you, don't worry about it, no problem. But it's in the big hurts that we need to know how to forgive. Because, as I said, forgiving people can be one of the most difficult things we will ever have to do in our entire life. And so there's, I think, a very good model of how to forgive, how to hold on to forgiveness, developed by Dr. Everett Worthington. I mentioned him before. He's the guy whose mother was brutally murdered. He's a Christian university researcher and professor that concentrates on forgiveness. And he had to apply his own model in forgiving the man who murdered his mother. The model, it's a 5-step model called the REACH model, based on the English word reach, R-E-A-C-H. You're reaching for forgiveness and to hold on to it. So each of those 5 letters stands for something, and it's kind of in the shape of a pyramid. The bottom letter, the R, which stands for recall the hurt, it moves up ultimately to the H, hold on to forgiveness. So R stands for recall the hurt. In order to forgive someone, we need to be honest with ourselves about the wrong that was done to us. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, we may try to minimize or deny the hurt because it cuts so deeply. Or, on the other hand, we may overreact to minor slights and hurts and think that the offender did far worse than he or she actually did to us. And we may think things like, if only this hadn't happened, I'd be happier or more successful or have a more fulfilled life. But what Worthington points out is, we need to honestly evaluate the nature of the wrong, its true effect on us, and how we have been reacting to it. Because we may have an overly sensitive attitude that causes us to easily be offended at others when, objectively speaking, we should not be. And furthermore, we may have contributed to the conflict and to the problem through our own sinful behavior. So Worthington suggests certain steps that can help us recalling the hurt. We should begin with prayer, praying for the presence of the Lord as our protector, and invoking the Holy Spirit as our comforter. And we should monitor ourselves as we recall the hurt and the details surrounding what happened to make sure that we are not slipping into rage or fear or depression. We need to recall what happened, but also try to recall how we felt when it was happened. Because remember, there are really 2 aspects to forgiveness. There's decisional forgiveness and the emotional replacement, the emotional forgiveness. And so as we're dealing with this, particularly in big cases, we need to take slow, calm, deep breaths to help control ourselves and our reaction. And as we're recalling, we should try to see things from the other person's point of view. It's commonly said there are 2 sides to every story. And this will work particularly well in dealing with the smaller hurts. And so you might want to begin there. But again, as we'll see, looking at things from the other person's point of view is going to be very important when we get to the next step. But one writer says this, that the pain that someone sticks us with asks us a simple question. What are you going to do with me? You didn't want me, but you got to do something with me. And as I said, when we ruminate, when we're unforgiving, and we ruminate and we on the hurt and the other person, we lie in bed at night thinking of things that we would like to do to him and so on and so forth, we're actually making our own situation worse. Now we can try to forget about it and stuff it in the back of our mind, but it will be there constantly pricking us. Or we can forgive it and heal it. And which path we choose is up to us. Which leads to the second step. R stands for recall to hurt. The E stands for empathize. To empathize with the offender is to see his humanity. In other words, to try and think what he was thinking and the effect of the event on him or her. I use him generically here. To empathize is to truly see that if you would have been in his shoes, you yourself would likely have done the same thing that he did. Famous American President Abraham Lincoln at the time of our Civil War. The big issue, of course, in our country at that time was slavery. And he said, listen, the Southerners, the slave owners, if we would have been in their shoes, we probably would have acted just like them. We can't see them as demons or monsters or devils or things like that. They're human beings too. Now, what they were doing was very wrong, and we ended up fighting a very terrible war to eliminate slavery. But Lincoln was quite correct. So many of the abolitionists in the North just had a terrible attitude towards people which, if they would have been in their shoes, they probably would have had the same or similar attitudes and acted the same way. Now, to empathize with somebody is to start to see him as God does, as a human being much like yourself, not a thing, not a monster, not a demon. Now, this is probably the hardest part when it comes to emotional forgiveness, because Jesus says we're to love our enemies, but we can't do that on our own power. In our own power, we all often want to hurt our enemies and to see them pay for what they've done to us, to see them suffer as we have suffered. We want to call down fire from heaven on them. And yet Jesus says, call down blessings from heaven on them. That is the sign of Christ-likeness. That is the sign of God working in us to change us inside. And so we can do this only with God's help. And so even if we can't, it's going to take some time to empathize, to kind of see things through the other person's eyes. But we can at least begin by learning ways to sympathize with the person, to feel compassion for those who've harmed us, which ultimately should lead to our loving our enemies. Because true, lasting, life-changing forgiveness depends upon feeling differently about the person who hurt us. That's why true forgiveness, can be a very hard process, but it is truly a life-changing process. It is, as I think I said in an earlier lecture, perhaps one of the most Christ-like things we can ever do. Now, for 10 years, Worthington and his colleagues studied more than 1,000 couples or individuals and compared two types of forgiveness. What he called self-benefit forgiving. Forgiving in order to get. In other words, forgiving to feel better, and because you are, you're feeling bad. So you want to try to get free. But then he also looked at forgiving for giving. Not forgiving in order to get for yourself, but forgiving because you, the victim, are the only person who can give the offender what he needs, namely forgiveness. You're doing it for the benefit of the other person, not for yourself. And what he found was amazing. He said people who forgave in the self-benefit group achieved more forgiveness right away than those who forgave in the empathy-based group. But for 1 hour or 8 hours, the self-benefit forgiveness was modest. For those in the empathy-based group, they were forgiving in order to give to the other person. 1 hour produced little forgiveness, but 8 hours produced a lot of forgiveness, over 5 times as much. And when they checked with those people 6 weeks later, the level of forgiveness in the self-benefit group had dropped to about half as much as at the time of the treatment. But in the empathy-based group, the level of forgiveness stayed high. And Worthington concluded that forgiveness does benefit us. But if we forgive mainly to get things for ourselves, to make us feel better, we just get a trickle of those benefits. If we give the gift of forgiveness to a needy perpetrator, we receive freedom, peace, and perhaps health and relational repair. Forgiveness gushes like water from a fire hose. It washes us clean. It frees us. Now, empathy is experienced at 3 levels. Understanding. In other words, you understand the point of view of the other person. Number 2, emotional identification. You feel and think with the other person. And 3, compassion. You feel compassion for the other person, as well as understanding him and emotionally identifying with him. To achieve deep, lasting forgiveness, we need to reach this deepest level of empathy, compassionate empathy. Now, I heard a speaker and a writer who I think was very good is named Rebecca Pippert. She's written a couple of books, and I heard a seminar that she gave. And in one of those, in her seminar, she was talking about a person who had hurt her and hurt her family very deeply. And she would always talk negatively about this person. Well, you know, but she knew she shouldn't be doing this. And her husband, she said, well, what should I do? Her husband said, well, first, every time you open your mouth and his name comes up, stop running him down. Stop dissing him. Stop talking negatively about him. She said, well, who asked you? Well, you did. So she consciously had to bite her tongue and stop. The beginning of the process was to stop talking negatively about this guy whenever she opened her mouth. But later on, she started thinking about him and praying to God to open her eyes to see things from that person's perspective. And she said it ended up being life-changing. She started having sympathy for this guy. And that's where we need to get in these big hurts. Now, Worthington suggests that there are a number of factors that can increase our empathy with the wrongdoer. Soft emotions, fear, stress, worry, often underlie anger and hostility. And so that person, you need to understand, may have been undergoing fear, stress, worry, and hurt, which kind of led him or her to lash out or do the things that he did to you. Secondly, people are influenced by our circumstances, our conditions, and our situation. And we're hardwired for survival. And so we tend to automatically react to perceived danger or whatever by lashing out or hurting. We do it, but again, what we're saying here is you need to understand that the person who hurt you was also probably reacting to these things in a very human way. People are conditioned by past experiences. And so something in that person's past may have led him to do something to hurt you. You could not perceive it, but he did. People often act without thinking things through, okay? And that may well be what happened to you. And we should never forget that we are Christians, and therefore, by God's grace and the power of the Holy Spirit, we should react to an attack or hurt by somebody else by putting off our old self and putting on our new self in Christ. We put on the mind of Christ. Now, Worthington suggests a number of techniques to help us empathize with the other person. Pray for the gift of empathy. Write a descriptive letter as if you were the other person who hurt you, explaining your motives. Write a letter of apology from the offender's point of view. Talk to an empty chair, telling the offender what you think and feel as if the offender were actually sitting there, and then reverse roles. Talk to a friend or participate in a group of fellow believers to help you work through the forgiveness issues. Make or do something to symbolize your tender feelings for the other person. Meditate on Christ's compassion for not only you, but for people like the other person. And pray for the other person. Not praying that the fire of heaven would come down, but that God would draw near to him, would bless him, and would transform him into a Christ-like person. That's what helped Rebecca Pippert to get over her anger. So, R, recall the hurt. E, empathize. A stands for the altruistic gift of forgiveness. Altruism is non-self-centered love. It is doing something for the sake of the other person, not to get something yourself. It is a gift. And now Christians need to meditate on our own sins, which have been forgiven by God, and the wrongs we have done that have been forgiven by other people. Because when we come to deeply understand our own humanity, we're much more likely to forgive those who have wronged us. Remembering our own guilt and shame for specific wrongs that we have done, we should remember the deep sense of freedom and gratitude that we received when we have been forgiven for those wrongs. So altruism is others-oriented love. It's giving without expecting anything in return. And one of the greatest gifts that we can give to anybody is the gift of forgiveness. To be forgiven is freeing, it's uplifting, it can be life-changing. It's the gift that Christ has given us, and we need to give it, not expecting anything in return, simply because we're Christians. We've been forgiven, and we should want to. We should want to act like Christ and experience Christ-likeness. But then the C is commit publicly to forgive. Remember, forgiveness, first and foremost, is something that happens inside of us, okay? We forgive from our heart and our mind without even saying anything to the other person. We'll talk in a later lecture about when and how to say, I forgive you. That doesn't have to necessarily happen, but forgiveness, first and foremost, is something that happens inside of us. But committing publicly to forgive, after we've already made the decision to forgive, is very important, because that helps to reinforce the decision to forgive. It reinforces our emotional forgiveness, and it combats the doubts about whether we've really forgiven the offender when these doubts and thoughts arise in our mind later on when we think about the offender and the event. And so, committing publicly to forgive, it's kind of like baptism or participating in the Lord's Supper. It's the outward and visible sign of our inward and spiritual grace and state. Now, there are several techniques that we can use to help us publicly commit to forgive. First of all, as with Rebecca Pippert, number one, we need to discipline our minds not to criticize the other person, particularly when negative thoughts come up. Tell ourselves to let it go, to stop finding fault. Change the subject mentally. And secondly, we can symbolize our forgiveness. We can write down the transgressions on our hand and then wash our hand until the transgression fades away. With repeated washings, it will fade away. Or you can hold a large rock in your hand. Remember, Jesus said when they were going to stone the woman caught in adultery, whichever one of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone. Well, hold a large rock in your hand outstretched like this. It symbolizes that first stone. And when the discomfort of holding the rock outstretched, becomes too great, drop it. Let it go. Your arm is freed. It's kind of like, okay, I have forgiven him. It's a symbolic thing. Or write down the transgressions on a piece of paper and then burn it and scatter the ashes. Or write down the transgression on a piece of paper and nail it to a wooden cross. Or maybe leave it underneath a cross in your church, if you have a cross in the church. You can write out a formal certificate of forgiveness. On such and such a date, I, Jonathan Menn, have forgiven person X for doing this, that, or the other thing. And hold on to that and sign it. And because then you've always got it. When you have these thoughts, you can go back. Wait a minute. No, I have forgiven him. Here's the certificate to prove it. Tell somebody else about the forgiveness, because that is a person you can always call on if you have negative thoughts that arise in your mind. And act towards the other person as if you have fully forgiven him. As your behavior becomes habitual, it will reinforce the decision to forgive and the emotional forgiveness that you have made as well. And finally, the H. So R, recall the hurt. E, empathize with the offender. A, offer the altruistic gift of forgiveness. C, commit publicly to forgive. And H stands for hold on to forgiveness. Because negative thoughts and feelings naturally can arise, and these can happen when you see the other person, or maybe on an anniversary date, or if you're in a particular place, or you hear something. These thoughts just come up into our mind. And then it's times like these we need to remember that we've forgiven him and hold on to that forgiveness. And in doing this, we need to realize that the pain of a remembered hurt is not the same as unforgiveness. Unforgiveness requires rumination, dwelling on it, and desiring vengeance. No, the fact that I remember this, I remember I was really hurt, that's not the same as unforgiveness. So when these thoughts come up, don't dwell on the negative emotions. Distract yourself. Sing, pray, praise the Lord. Do some physical activity rather than just sitting there and dwelling on it. Thirdly, remind yourself that you have forgiven the other person. Remind yourself of the times you've publicly committed to forgive. Seek reassurance from your partner or friend or somebody who you have told that you've forgiven this person. And use the documents you've created. Read the certificate of forgiveness and what have you done. And you can, again, look over, think through, and practice again the REACH model. But in concluding this lecture, Worthington goes on to say that one thing that will help us not only with forgiving particular hurts, but will help us in general, is to become a more forgiving person. Now, this takes a lifetime, but it helps to build and mold our character to be more like Christ. And the process of becoming a more forgiving person helps us make real and hold on to the forgiveness that we have granted to somebody for particular wrongs. Now, he lists several techniques that we can use to become more forgiving people. Number one, reflect on why we want to be more forgiving. Ask the Lord to search our hearts for our motives. Are we being self-centered, or do we want to be obedient to him and act out of gratitude, love, and compassion? Secondly, Identify our greatest wounds from the past and forgive them. Strive to reach emotional as well as decisional forgiveness. So go through the REACH model, because we all have a lot of things, maybe from our childhood, that are still bugging us. The people may be dead. They're far away. And you still held on to them. Go through, clean that out. Clean out your past. Number 3, forgive one wound at a time. Don't say, I hereby forgive all the wounds of my past. No, go through them one at a time. Go through the REACH model and cleanse yourself. Number 4, identify heroes of forgiveness. When you read about or talk with people who have successfully forgiven much, it can be a great inspiration and encouragement, which is one reason why biographies of good, deep Christians throughout history can be so helpful, because most of those Christians who are the deepest are those who suffered the most, but who also forgave the most. Number 5, examine yourself. Unforgiveness can become a habit, so be honest with yourself and keep short accounts. Number 6, reduce negative traits, but cultivate virtue. Consciously strive to be a more virtuous person in areas beyond simply forgiveness. In other words, be specific, not only about what you want to avoid, but what you want to do. For example, you might say to yourself, and you can write this down, if I were a more loving person, I would do what? I'd compliment people more. I'd try to understand them. I'd try to be a better listener. I would try to do this, that, or the other thing more often. Number 7, change your experience of the past. Use your empathy and imagine Jesus comforting the person who hurt you. This will help to change your perception and your memory of the other person and of the hurtful event. You can plan a self-improvement strategy. Try to approach your life consciously and conscientiously, giving yourself time to meditate, pray, plan, and relax, because lives that are overwhelmed with busyness tend to be more difficult to control. Try to get on top of your life and your time. And as a matter of fact, in our Ecclesia book on stewardship, biblical stewardship, we have a whole section on the stewardship of time. Hugely important, because if you don't control your time, you don't control your life. Number 9, practice forgiving under imagined conditions. Try and think in advance situations that may arise and may require forgiveness. Number 10, practice forgiving day to day. As you plan your day, think about the people you're going to run into, you're going to be dealing with, hold them in prayer, and when hurtful situations occur, model forgiveness promptly. You're becoming proactive, in other words. Number 11, seek help from someone you trust. Friends you trust, pastors, others who are trained in the Scriptures and in the art of forgiveness can provide invaluable counsel. And number 12, you can start a campaign to love your enemies. You can do this either individually or, better, with the church, with your small group, with some group, to pray, plan, and implement strategies to actually do good to your enemies. Be proactive in demonstrating Christ's love to the unlovable, because there's all kinds of things. By the way, in our book on the church, its nature, mission, and purpose, we talk a lot about mission, being engaged in your community. This is kind of what it's talking about right here, because when you do this, you are showing the love of Christ to others. You are showing what Christ is really like and what the church is and should be. So this can have revolutionary, life-changing effects, not only for you, but for others. And it will help you not be so offended and help you be a better forgiver. And you will be showing others the way of forgiveness in your own life.